Good evening, everybody. ഇത് നമുക്ക് രണ്ട് ഇന്റർനാഷണൽ ട്രെയിനർമാരാണ് ഉള്ളത്. What is the biggest problem of the world today? The answer. We have so many answers. But according to PERELSTEIN, it is the lack of emotional education in our schools, colleges, home, or even at workplaces. Due to this, what happens? Violence, abuse, addiction, divorce, even suicide increases. So he started an international non-profit teaching method to teach emotional intelligence. Using this method, how a person can manage his inner world of peace, passion, and purpose in life. We have another eminent personality. It is none other than MATHIS. And he is working in the field of health education. Now he is acting as a consultant trainer, writer, speaker, representing the Chicago Institute for EQ4PEACE. This is the 13th program. With your permission, I welcome MATHIS for taking the session. Over to you, MATHIS, please.
Okay, I'll share my screen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. All right, I'll share the screen and we'll get started here.
Okay.
Okay. Slideshow. Oh, slideshow. There we go. Okay, here we go.
Okay, now it is clear. Everything is clear, sir.
Okay, we're ready to go then. All right, so today we're going to talk about applying the principles and practices of positive mental health to the mental and emotional challenges of adulthood. Last week we did teenage years and early adulthood. We're going to do adulthood today. Now, I try to make a list of some of the challenges of adulthood. Figured there's job stress, pressure, and sometimes loss. There's marriage and divorce. There's being a parent. There's parenting children. And there's a whole bunch of unhealthy life habits that people have to contend with. And there's also a lot of boredom nowadays and what we call whining or intolerance. And also financial debt is another thing people are struggling with a lot. So why I take a tool approach. I have something called the mental and emotional toolkit for life. And why I do that is because regardless of what you're trying to fix or build, there's only a limited number of tools that can be brought to bear to that task. Now, the trick is knowing what tool is called for and getting good at using them. And that's what I'm going to try to demonstrate today. Now, the tools, number one is understanding and appreciating the role emotion plays in everyday life. Number two is having unconditional self-acceptance, or USA. Number three is unconditional other acceptance, or UOA. The fourth one is a very important one called developing an internal locus of control. Number five is recognizing irrational thinking in yourself and others. Number six is what I call a think, feel, do thermostat model, and I'll show you demonstrations of that. Number seven is challenging and correcting irrational thinking in yourself and others. Number eight is recognizing when you have what we call mistaken goals. Number nine is a simple way to evaluate thoughts, feelings, and actions. Number 10 is asserting yourself with what we call I messages. And number 11, the last one, is understanding why change is hard and what it takes. Now, these tools are a mix of the 3 steps that Matt talks about with PMH, awareness, acceptance, and action. Now, I believe people can and will do much to help themselves if given the right tools and shown how to use them. When I was a kid, I was working construction. I always remember an older guy saying to me, "Kid, any job is easy if you use the right tool." And that's how this is too. If you use the right tool, mental health can be relatively easy to manage. Now, so we'll start talking about job stress, pressure, and loss. Now, stress and pressure are really anxiety, okay? Now, here's a couple things I think it's important to know about anxiety. Anxiety is called a figment of imagination. The reason is because it's about things that could happen, but haven't happened yet and often never do. So it's a future tense emotion. Now, there's a formula for anxiety. It's catastrophize plus awfulize equals anxiety. First, you imagine something bad happening, and then you tell yourself it'll be awful if that did happen. Because if you said, so what, who cares, it's not that big a deal, you wouldn't have anxiety. Now, these are some things that might happen, which are all real possibilities. Not doing well at work, a coworker or a boss is dissatisfied with your performance, you get a poor evaluation, possibly even lose your job, and then your loss of income, and maybe an inability to find another job. That happens at some time. Now, this is a formula I always teach people. It's event plus thoughts equals feelings. And it's part of developing an internal locus control. Now, what this formula tells us is anything others say or do, or that happens, or might at work or anywhere else, is just an event in our life. Events can be real, or they can be imagined, or they can be remembered. Now, but it's really thoughts about those events, be they real, imagined, or remembered, that cause how we feel, not the events themselves. No one upsets us, we upset ourselves. Now, so what that tells us is stress, pressure, and anxiety don't come from outside us. They come from inside us. And that's good news because that gives us control over those. They come from what we choose to think about, or how we choose to look at what happens, or what we imagine might happen. Others don't and can't put pressure on us, okay? We do that to ourselves. And the way we do, they can say and do things, but it's our choice ultimately how we look at what they say and do. Now, I want to talk a second do a little diversion here to something called peer pressure, because I used to talk about this a lot as a health education teacher, because a lot of times people believe kids do things because of peer pressure. This could apply to a workplace too. It's a misleading term. And the reason it's a misleading term, because it makes it sound like the pressure comes from outside. And when teachers talk to kids about peer pressure, they typically teach kids how to deal with what others say and do. And what happens is kids rarely do what they're taught. And the reason is because the teachers don't address the real internal cause, which is what kids think about others. For example, if you take others' acceptance or approval, they could not care about it. And if they did, there'd be no pressure at all to conform with what other people want. But if they want others people's acceptance or approval, then there will be some concern about not conforming to what other people want, and there'll be some pressure. But if they start to think they need other kids' acceptance and approval, now they'll generate anxiety, okay, because the threat is much bigger if they don't get it, and they'll generate much more pressure. So the pressure really comes from what they think about others' acceptance and approval, not from what others say or do. Now, to go back to our formula here, anything that happens at work, or what your boss or coworkers might say or do, or what you might imagine would happen, those are all fall under the event in the formula. Anxiety, stress, and pressure fall under feelings. And in the middle there are thoughts. We have all these host of cognitive choices we make all the time. You're making them right now. For example, how you look at what happens or might, what meaning you attach to it, what you focus on, what you compare things to, what you remember about the past, what you imagine will happen in the future, what you expect of yourself, others in life, how much importance you attach to what does happen or what might, and what you spend your time actually thinking about. Now, there's three ways you can basically look at things. You could not care about something, and you could sort of not care about it or really not care about it. then you could start to want, prefer, or desire something. Or you could think you need it, it's a necessity in your life, and demand it. And you could sort of, you think you need it, or you could really think you need it. Now, one of my favorite quotes is, "Expectation is the root of all heartache." That's from William Shakespeare. Now, I always teach people that you have a right to want whatever you want. But once you start to want something, there's always a possibility you might not accomplish or get what you want. That will be perceived as a potential threat. If you tell ourselves we have to do it, it magnifies the threat out of proportion to reality, and we generate anxiety instead of concern. So if we set our think thermostat at want to, the threat is medium and we'll have concern. But if we turn that thermostat up to, excuse me, telling ourselves we have to do something or have to accomplish something, then the threat of possibly not doing that is much larger, and we generate anxiety. Now, the reason that's important is because emotion is energy to move. It's there to help us deal with perceived threats, to fight or flight if the threat is great, to help us get what we want and need. Now, the greater the difference between our expectations and reality, excuse me, it's morning, the greater the perceived threat will be and the more emotion we'll generate. That's built into us. We're hardwired to do that. Now, anxiety comes from, excuse me, I have to take a drink here. Anxiety comes from making demands of yourself or life before a life event. Now, for example, if you say to yourself, I have to do a good job on this, I can't make any mistakes, everything has to go perfectly, nothing can go wrong. Those would be examples of demands of self and life before an event. Now, the ultimate demand would be, I have to be perfect and do everything perfectly all the time. Everything has to be perfect all the time and go perfectly. Now, we need to talk about stress and anxiety. We also need to talk about the symbolic self. Symbolic self is the person we want to be and be seen as by others. Now, imagining we won't accomplish what we want to will be a threat, a perceived threat to the symbolic self. A threat to the symbolic self gets treated by the brain the same as a threat to life or limb. And it's one of the many ways that we magnify threats out of proportion to reality and will cause anxiety. Now, the way anxiety can impair performance is if you plug into your flight response because you create this perceived threat, it's harder to function at the level you're capable of or want to when you have this overwhelming urge to flee a situation you're in, be it at work or wherever. And anxiety can also morph into anger, and flight can morph into fight, and people can lash out at others. And people do that often at work, at home, and other places. This is how I might diagram that. But it all begins with you setting your thermostat at have to instead of want to. Now, if we tell ourselves we have to before a life event, we're more likely to do what we call should on ourselves after the life event if things don't go as we wanted. And that'll cause us to generate shame or guilt. And this is how I would diagram it. So you set your thermostat at have to before an event, and you generate anxiety versus concern. And then afterwards, if things don't go well, you're more likely to say, I should have done better, I shouldn't have made any mistakes, and generate shame or guilt, versus just saying, I wish I had, or I wish I hadn't, and having regret or remorse. Now, you can get into a vicious cycle where you're telling yourself, I have to before, and generate anxiety, and that's impairing your performance. And then afterwards, you're shooting on yourself, which next time, you're more likely to think even more that you have to do something perfectly and have to do something right. And that can be emotionally exhausting to go through this vicious cycle. And it can end in burnout, shutting down to protect yourself, substance abuse to deal with the feelings that you're struggling with. And with athletes, for example, sometimes they end up injured. And sometimes we even see people attempt to take their own lives because of the cycle they get into. Now, As far as what to do about stress, you hear about stress management a lot. I like to talk about stress prevention, okay? Because an ounce of prevention is always worth a pound of cure. And as a health education teacher, I'm what they call a prevention specialist. Now, we need to talk about the difference between getting better versus feeling better. There are a lot of ways to temporarily feel better. Some of them are healthy, like exercise or yoga or meditation. Others are not, like drugs. They all give us a temporary vacation from events and the thoughts and feelings that go with them. But when you stop doing them or sober up, the events are often waiting for you, if only in your mind, and thoughts and feelings you have about those events return. So getting better means permanently reducing the frequency, intensity, and duration of anxiety or stress or pressure. And the only way to do that is to change the way you think. Now, one of the strategies we use is called staying in the now, where you practice and rehearse this to the point where it's your automatic response to feeling stressed or anxious. And it's basically to say that might happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And if it does, I'll deal with it, just like others do, just like I have other things in the past. Now, the first two statements basically cancel out catastrophizing. And the last three statements basically do what I call de-awfulizing the possibility of that happening. Now, you can also challenge the demands you make of yourself. For example, if you're saying, I have to do something, you can pose simple questions. Why do you have to? You have to or just want to? You have to or just would like to? And the only correct answers to those statements are, I don't have to. I don't have to, I just want to. I don't have to, I just like to. I don't have to do anything. Now, you can also challenge the converse of that. If you say, I can't make mistakes, I can't let this happen, why can't you? You can't or just don't want to. You can't or just wouldn't like to. And the only real answers are, the only correct answers are, I can, I just don't want to. I can, I just wouldn't like to. I can do whatever I put my mind to or whatever I want to. Now, so what we're trying to do is turn our thermostat down from have to or can down to want to or don't want to. And what will happen is then we're more likely to generate simple concern rather than anxiety. And if things don't go well, we're more likely to simply wish we hadn't done something or wish we had and have regret and remorse instead of shame or guilt. Now, remember the formula for anxiety is catastrophize plus awfulize. So another thing you can do is take awfulizing and contest that or challenge that. For example, would it be awful or would it just be unpleasant? Would it be awful or just inconvenient? Would it be awful or just uncomfortable? And hopefully you come to realize that it wouldn't be awful. It's not the worst possible thing that could be happening. It'd just be unpleasant. It'd just be inconvenient or uncomfortable. Well, it's always funny when I do these, I see mistakes that I never caught when I was going through it. Okay, so what you're trying to do is turn your thermostat down from awful to unpleasant, inconvenient, and uncomfortable. And that would cause you to generate concern. Now, if you could get down to I don't care, that's fine. But that's not necessarily the goal. We just want to turn your thermostat down a notch. Now, the other thing you can do is come up with some what we call effective coping statements to attack or deal with the awfulizing part of the formula. For example, it wouldn't be that big a deal. It wouldn't be the end of the world. Worse things have happened. I've survived worse. If others can handle it, so can I. Now, the other thing we have to contend with is a type of irrational thinking called can't stand it-itis. And we all have the right to like or dislike whatever we want to. But what people do is they turn their thermostat up to thinking that and telling themselves, I couldn't stand it if that happened. I'd just die. I'd go crazy if that happened. And then they generate anxiety. So what you want to do is challenge that with a simple question. You couldn't stand it or just wouldn't like it. And hopefully you realize the answer is I could stand it, I just wouldn't like it. Because if you couldn't stand something, you'd die or go crazy. You're not going to go die and go crazy every time you tell yourself you can't stand something. Now, so what you want to do is try to turn your thermostat down one notch to I can stand it, I just wouldn't like it. And then you'll be more likely to generate concern instead of anxiety. Now, as far as shoulding on yourself after an event, we always tell people, stop shoulding on yourself, or teach people to say, I'm not going to should on myself today. Now, what we want you to do instead is simply wish that you had done something different, or wish you hadn't done something. And that'll cause you to have regret, remorse. And then next time around, you're more likely to simply want to do something or not want to do something versus thinking you have to or can't. Now, the best attitude you can have ultimately is, I have absolutely nothing to lose and everything to gain by doing what I'm about to do, or trying to do what I'm about to do. Now, the other thing you have to look at is, one of the choices you have, the cognitive choices, is what meaning you attach to what happens. And that's a very, very important, especially when things don't turn out as you want. Now, one of the things people tend to do is they tend to do what Dr. Albert Ellis calls label and damn themselves. And that causes shame and guilt. For example, saying I'm stupid, I'm an idiot, or I'm a failure. And label and damning is overgeneralization. It's like calling an apple bad because simply because it has a bruise. It's condemning the doer, condemning yourself instead of just what you did. Now, so the questions we pose there are, why are you a failure just because of that? You're an idiot or just did an idiotic thing? You're stupid or just did something you didn't like? You're stupid or just a fallible human being? Now, and hopefully you'll learn to answer that. I'm not stupid, or I'm not a failure. I'm not an idiot just because of that. I'm not a failure. I just failed, or I did some stupid thing or an idiotic thing. I'm not stupid. I just did something I didn't like. And I'm not a failure. I'm just a fallible human being. Okay. Now, the other thing we always encourage people to do is choose to have unconditional self-acceptance to combat the shame that might come with not performing at a level you'd like to, or accomplishing something you'd like to. And that means to choose to see whatever you think, feel, say, or do, have in the past or might in the future, as part of being human and understandable given what my life experiences have been and what I have to deal with at the moment. Now, you need to be willing to look at what you do and how you manage things, manage your mental health, in order to be able to fix it. And shame can block change. For example, people can be ashamed of the fact that they stress themselves out, or put needless pressure on themselves, or generate a lot of anxiety. But the whole point is, that's part of being human. It's part of being human to stress yourself out needlessly. A lot of people do it. It's part of being human to put needless pressure on yourself, or generate more anxiety than is necessary, or to should on yourself. That's part of being a human being too. Or believing you're not living up to expectations and making yourself feel ashamed needlessly. Now, reason is I say it's part of being human is because you're certainly not going to ever be the first person to do those things, or believe you're not living up to expectations in some way. And you certainly won't be the last. You're always going to have a lot of company in doing those things. Now, there's some other coping statements you could use, and we encourage people to have. For example, no one's perfect, and I don't have to be perfect. Everyone makes mistakes. We all do the best we can at the time. I did the best I could under the circumstances, based on what my life has been like and what I had to deal with at the moment. Whatever I did was good enough. Wasn't perfect, but good. It was good enough. And we're all FHBs, or fallible human beings, who at times think, feel, say, and do things that make life worse for ourselves and sometimes for others. All right, so let's move on to marriage and divorce now. One of the things I think is important to start out with is it's very important to learn from your history so you won't be doomed to repeat it. Now, we all create ruts in our brains as we go through our lives, as we practice certain ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving as we grow up. We also create ruts in our brain from watching our parents interact. It's called observational learning. Now, ruts make thoughts, feelings, and behaviors automatic. And because of that, ruts can cause people to recreate their past, because they kind of slip into their old way of thinking, feeling, and behaving all the time. And ruts can cause our history to become our destiny. That can be a good or bad thing, depending on what your history is. But if it was bad in some way, you need to watch for evidence that we're recreating our past. The reason being because you can never really get rid of these old ruts. You can only create some new ones and hope those compete with use for the old ones. Now, as I said earlier, there's always three basic ways you can look at something. You could not care about it. You could sort of not care about it, or really not care about it. You could want it, could really want it, or sort of want it, and you could think you need it. Now, these are some things people think they need: love, acceptance, approval, to be with someone in a relationship, perhaps to get married, and perhaps to have sex. Now, people will often start to equate those things with air, water, and food in their own minds. Now, that makes not getting them or losing them seem like suffocating, dying from thirst or hunger. Now, we all have the right to want whatever we want. That's one of my basic rules I always teach. But when people start to think they need things they simply want and that are simply nice to have, it can make otherwise smart people do stupid things. And here's how I explain that. If you were suffocating, what would you be willing to do to get air? And of course, the answer is anything. So suppose someone thinks they need love or to be with someone like they need air, water, or food. What might they be willing to do to get that love or keep from losing it? The answer, unfortunately, is the same: anything. And that's what can make other people, or otherwise smart people, do stupid things sometimes. Now, this is the way I would diagram it. One of our other rules is a person's behavior will tend to follow his or her feelings toward his or her life events. Okay, so if we set our thermostat at need, that predisposes us to have anxiety instead of concern, to be depressed instead of simply sad, to have shame instead of regret, to have a high frequency, intensity, duration of loneliness versus a medium or low frequency, intensity, duration. And that all predisposes us to react or overreact to situations, which is what can cause us to do stupid things and make mistakes. Now, there are events that encourage perceived needs. For example, family expectations, cultural expectations. People should be married by a certain age. Okay, popular love songs make love sound like it's a need, like Beatles song, "All We Need Is Love." Seeing peers in relationships can make you start to think you need to be in one too. Seeing peers marrying may cause you to start thinking you should be married too, or having children. Those are all things that can encourage people to be more likely to perceive things as needs rather than simply wants, preferences, and desires. Now, so how do you challenge perceived needs? The way I do it is to say you need air, water, and food. You'll die in minutes, days, or weeks without them. I ask people, will you die if you don't get as much of those other things like love as you'd like? People live their entire life sometimes without as much love or acceptance or approval as they would like. Do you need them like you need air, water, and food, or are they just nice to have? And finally, I would ask, do you need them or just want them? Okay. Now, so hopefully what we're trying to do is turn your thermostat down to want. Okay. And you have a right to want whatever you want. But if you don't get those things or lose them, then you'll simply be concerned, sad, and have regret, or perhaps some remorse, and have a moderate frequency, intensity, duration of loneliness. And you have some energy to move to make your life better, but you're also still free to respond in the best possible way. Now, the best hope for a successful marriage is for both people to have good emotional management. Now, there's two ways to make a situation. It's one of my rules I always live by. There's two ways to make a situation you don't like worse: do nothing and overreact to it. And people too often do the latter. Now, if you generate anxiety or anger, that predisposes you to overreact or react to a situation rather than respond to it. You have so much energy to move that you're not as free to respond as you might otherwise be. Now, so how do you prevent needless conflict? Well, both spouses need to keep their field thermostats turned down. At least one of them. There's an old saying, you always need at least one adult in the room. Well, at least one of them needs to keep their thermostat turned down. And you need to be able to turn them down quickly should they go up, because they may very well go up, because we have all these old ruts for plugging into anger and other feelings from our past. Now, when you get angry and overreact, it may play out as arguing, fighting, or verbal abuse. Okay. Now, what we want to do is turn it down to frustration, irritation, or annoyance, because you have some energy to move to try to make your life better, but you're still relatively free to respond, and you can engage in problem solving, just simply figuring out how to make things better for both of you. Okay, now some helpful tools to keep your thermostat turned down or turn it quite quickly if should it go up is to have an internal locus of control and to recognize when each other is engaging in irrational thinking and to correct that irrational thinking in yourself and tactfully challenge it in the other person. Now, to go back to our formula, to have an internal locus of control, this is the formula we tend to teach. Event plus thoughts equals feelings. And as I said earlier, anything the other person says or does is just an event. It's my thoughts that cause my feelings, not what they say and do. It's my choice how I want to look at things. Therefore, it's my choice how I want to feel. No one upsets me, I upset myself. And no one upsets them, they upset themselves. They're not responsible how I feel, I am. And I'm not responsible how they feel, they are. It's not my job to make them feel good. And it's not their job to make me feel good. It's my job to make myself feel good. And it's their job to make themselves feel good. That's having an internal locus of control, which is usually the opposite of what many people go into a relationship thinking the other person's supposed to make them feel good and vice versa. Now, both people have a right to want, let's talk about correcting irrational thinking or identifying it. Both people have a right to want whatever they want. The mistake will be starting to demand what they simply desire. Anger comes from making demands, demanding that others be the way you want them to be and do what you want them to do. Now, if you desire that they do something a certain way and they don't, you're going to be frustrated, irritated, annoyed, but you're still free to respond to what you don't like. But if you demand that they be the way you want them to be and do what you want them to be and they don't, it's a much bigger perceived threat and you generate anger and react or overreact. Now, so let's challenge some of those demands of others. If you think or say they have to or they should, I'm going to ask you, why do they have to? They have to or you just want them to. They have to or you just like them to. And the only real answers are they don't have to do. They don't have to, I just want them to. They don't have to, I would just like them to. They don't have to do anything. No one has to do anything except die and pay taxes. Now, if you say they can't talk to me like that or they can't get away with that, why can't they? They can't or you just don't want them to. They can't or you just would like them to. And the only correct answers are they can, I just don't want them to. They can, I just wouldn't like them to. They can do whatever they want. Each person can do whatever they want. Now, the other type of thinking that can arise here is something called awfulizing, where there's a lot of things in life that other people might say or do that might be unpleasant for us, inconvenient or uncomfortable. What we do is we tell ourselves that's awful, like the worst possible thing that they could have said or done or that could have happened to us. By doing that, you're more likely to generate anger instead of frustration, irritation, or annoyance, and then you become more likely to react or overreact. So we want to turn that down. The way we do it is it awful or just unpleasant? Is it awful, just inconvenient? Is it awful, just uncomfortable? And hopefully we learn to realize it's not awful. It's just unpleasant, inconvenient, or uncomfortable. Now, and that brings our thermostat down a notch. We still might be frustrated, irritated, or annoyed, but we're more free to respond to a situation in the best possible way. Now, you each also have a right, everyone has the right to want, like or dislike whatever you want to. The mistake people make is they tell themselves they can't stand something that's happening to them. Like, I can't stand that they said that to me. And then you're more likely to inflame yourself needlessly. That's why we call it can't stand it itis. Itis is the suffix for inflammation. And you're more likely to generate anger then instead of simple frustration, irritation, or annoyance. So the way we try to bring the thermostat down there is to pose a simple question. You can't stand it or just don't like it. And hopefully you realize I can stand it. I just don't like it. And that's your right as a human being. Now, so we bring our thermostat down and we still might be frustrated, irritated, or annoyed, but we're free now to respond in the best possible way to a situation. Now, you can also label and damn the other person. Okay. Now, you could do that after you became angry, or you could do that. It could cause you to become angry. So it's kind of the chicken or the egg, which comes first. Label and damning, as I said earlier, is overgeneralization. Like calling an apple bad simply because it has a bruise, it's condemning the doer instead of the deed. And that's why it's irrational, because you're overgeneralizing. You're making something out of nothing or very little. Now, put downs and name calling, which is what label and damning is, will be perceived as a threat to the other person's symbolic self. Okay, now here's some things, for example, a spouse might say to another, you're an idiot, you're a jerk, you're stupid, you're inconsiderate, you're a bitch. Okay, those are the kind of things that commonly get said. Well, the questions we'd pose then is, why are they an idiot just because of that? They're an idiot or inconsiderate or whatever, or just did an inconsiderate thing. They're stupid or just did something you didn't like. They're a bitch or just a fallible human being like everyone else. And hopefully the answers you learn are they're not whatever just because of that. They're not whatever you say they were. They just did something I didn't like. And they're not that. They're just a fallible human being. Okay. Now, some other helpful tools would be to recognize when you each have what's called mistaken goals. Another one would be to know what you really want and always keep sight of that and never lose sight of it. And to evaluate your own thoughts and feelings and actions with respect to what you want. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that. Mistaken goals, we call them mistaken because you get something out of what you do. Behavior is always purposeful. It always starts and continues because it serves a purpose. But whatever you get out of a mistaken goal, by how you behave, it makes getting what you really want, for example, a healthy relationship, harder in the long run. Now, two mistaken goals that really can destroy marriages or relationships of any kind are power and control or revenge. And they usually tend to be driven or associated with anger. So if you get angry, you're more likely to make it about power and control instead of about just what's best for both people, or about revenge, about getting even. Now, the reality about control and revenge is you never can really control what someone else thinks, feels, says, or does. So it's kind of a fool's errand to get into power and control. Many people think and talk and act as if they can, but you only control what you think, feel, say, or do. And for most people, that's a big enough job. And also in trying to get even, you very often end up hurting yourself in the long run. So I feel like I get even with somebody, but then they're mad at me now, and now that relationship's going to go downhill instead of get better. Now, we used to call, my grandfather used to always say, you're cutting off your nose to spite your face, meaning you're hurting yourself just as much, if not more, than the other person by doing that. Now, some important questions I think it's helpful to ask in a marriage or any other relationship. What do you really want? How do you want to feel? What do you want your life to be like? Okay. Now, once you ask those questions, those are very important questions, but once you ask those, the other questions are what we call functional disputes, where you ask yourself, how's it working for you to think, feel, say, and do what you are now? Is it allowing you to get what you want, or is it making it harder? Is it allowing you to feel the way you'd like to feel? Is it allowing your life to play out the way you'd like it to, or is it making it harder? Okay. Now, and if you keep thinking, feeling, saying, and doing what you are now, are you likely to get what you really want in the future? Or are you making it increasingly less likely? Now, Dr. Paul Hauck used to come up with these little paradigms, very simple things. And this is one I always liked. He said, when you don't like a situation, you have four basic options. One is to problem solve and assert yourself. Now, of course, you have to be in the right mental and emotional place to be able to do that. If you're angry, making yourself angry and reacting or overreacting, that's not going to happen. So you have to be in the right mental and emotional place. The other one is to tolerate with disturbance. A lot of people put up with things they don't like and get all upset about it. The third one is to tolerate without disturbance. There's a lot of things my daughter does, for example, and my wife too, that I don't necessarily agree with or like, but I tolerate it without upsetting myself about it. And the final choice you have is to leave. Now, it helps to remember, though, that if you choose to tolerate something, you get what you tolerate, okay? If you tolerate it, the question is, what reason does somebody have to change the way they think, feel, say, or do something, okay? Now, that's true if you're a parent. It's true if you're a teacher. It's true if you're a husband or wife. Now, as far as the question about whether to leave or not, another question you could pose is if someone else thinks, feels, says, and does what they do, are you likely to get what you really want with them or from them? Are you likely to feel the way you'd like to with them? Okay. Now, once you clearly identify what you really want, the answers to the other questions are usually quite obvious. They just need to be asked. Okay. When conflicts do arise, it's always better to use something we call I messages instead of you messages. You messages are things like orders, like shut up, threats, you better do it or else, put downs, you're so stupid, or name calling, you're an idiot. Those are all called you messages because there's a you is the subject of the sentence, either implied or actually said. Now, you messages are also called solution messages because you try to take away from someone else their right to choose what they'll think, feel, say, or do. You're trying to tell them how to do those things. And nobody likes that. People will fight you over that. Okay. Now, it's kind of like Ukraine right now. People are fighting really hard just because someone's trying to dictate to them how their country's going to be. Now, you messages often involve finger pointing. And it usually involves pointing a finger at someone else, and no one likes that either because it feels threatening when somebody's pointing a finger at you. Now, I messages simply start with I. They simply give another person information, tell them what you like or don't like, what you want or don't want, and they leave it up to the other person as to what they want to do about it. And if you point your finger anywhere, you're pointing your finger at yourself. I would like you to stop doing that. I don't like when you talk to me like that. Now, the role of ruts and conflicts, I think, needs to be discussed because we all have ruts for thinking, feeling, saying, doing things certain ways in conflicts from prior practice and rehearsal and prior conflicts. Now, ruts make thoughts, feelings, and actions automatic. So what happens as soon as a conflict arises, it's easy to slip into those old ruts. It's hard to stay out of them. It's hard to get out of them once you slip into them. And once you slip into those ruts, conflicts can escalate very quickly because of those ruts. And very often arguments and conflicts play out the same way that they've played out many, many times. If you listen to people argue over a course of months or years, very often it just sounds like the same argument over and over again. Now, what I often do is encourage people, if you have a conflict, an alternative way to deal with it would be to write somebody a letter. Okay, because once you say things out loud, you can't take them back. Okay, you're less likely by writing a letter to slip into your old ruts. You can reflect on what you put down on paper and then edit it. And with word processing, that's a lot easier than it used to be handwriting things. Before you give it to them, you can change what you put down if you don't think it's going to come across very well. People will always read letters, often more than once. You get to make your points without interruption. And the way you do it is simply start every sentence with I. Force yourself to start every sentence with I. Say what, and also in addition to saying what you don't like and don't agree with and don't want, you want to also say what you, say what you like and what you want as well. And if you do a good job at this, it can make the next face-to-face easier and more constructive. And it often ends up, when you give people letters like this, they're usually so unique and different than what you're used to doing with each other. They often end up being a keepsake. Now, as far as divorce, some people unfortunately end up going through divorces. Sometimes it's simply because of irreconcilable differences. So how tough a divorce ends up being will depend on where someone sets their think thermostat regarding the other person. For example, if you don't care whether you continue to have that person in your life, it's easy to remain calm. You might even be relieved might even feel free to start over. But if you want that person to be in your life and then they're not going to be, you're going to have perhaps some concern, some sadness, frustration, irritation, annoyance, maybe some regret and remorse about things you said or did. Okay. But you're still free to respond to that situation. But if you think you need that person in your life, like you need air, water, and food, perhaps, now them leaving you is going to cause anxiety, depression, anger, and possibly shame or guilt, and you might react or overreact. And I don't know if this happens in India or not, but in the United States, we often have these post-divorce murder-suicides, where someone is left by another person and then they kill that person, then kill themselves. And that all stems from the fact that they set their thermostat at need, because that makes them angry that somebody left them, so they're more likely to kill that person. And after they kill that person, they're more likely to be depressed, feel shame or guilt, and take their own lives. Now let's switch to talking about being a parent and parenting children. Now, there are tools that can make you more effective parent. There are tools you can give children to help them have a better childhood and life and school experience. Now, the good news is the tools are the same. And the trick is getting good at using them in your own life. And if you do that, and you can be a role model for them. So the more you develop these tools in your own life, the better, the more likely they are to develop them in theirs. Now, the most important life skill is to have, most important life skill to have as a parent, and that you can give your children, is effective emotional management. Now, there's a life skills model that's out there. There's multiple ones, but this is one I've worked with. And basically, it says that emotional management is the first and most important skill. Okay. And then below that is self-soothing, goal setting, conflict resolution, problem solving. And the last one is academic skills like reading, writing, and arithmetic. Now, the reason that emotional management is so important is because you have to be in the right mental and emotional place to function at levels you're capable of, and that you and others want you to. And that's true for you as a parent, or them as a student or brother, sister, or anything else. Now, some helpful rules from parenting I've always had, and as a teacher, there's 2 ways to make something you don't like worse: do nothing, overreact to it. Next one's called the first do no harm rule. If you can't make it better, at least don't make it worse. And a lot of times you can't make things better, and you just don't want to make them worse. We always need at least one adult in the room. Another one is pick your fights carefully. And sometimes the best thing to do is nothing. And one of my favorite sayings is, it takes 1 fool to backtalk and 2 to make a conversation out of it. Okay. Now, if you're frustrated, irritated, or annoyed, you can act on these rules. You can abide by these rules, because you're free to respond to a situation in the best possible way. But if you make yourself angry, you become reactive and possibly overreact, and you're not going to follow those rules. You're going to do what angry people do. Now, there are all kinds of behaviors that parents worry kids will engage in. Now, the important point for parents to keep in mind is behavior starts and continues because it serves a purpose. Now, too much emotion can give purpose to all kinds of things, unhealthy behaviors like smoking, drinking, using drugs, eating too much, shutting down, dropping out, even suicide. Now, it can also cause too much emotion, tends to predispose children to adopt mistaken goals too. For example, if they're lonely, they're more likely to adopt the mistaken goal of attention. If they're angry, they might adopt the mistaken goal of power and control or revenge. If they have shame or anxiety, for example, regarding school, they might turn to avoiding failure. If they have anxiety, depression, shame, guilt, or loneliness, they might seek to withdraw from unpleasantness, avoid it, or get relief from how they feel. And they might do that with drugs, alcohol, or even suicide. Now, one of the ways to deal with shame is to teach and encourage children to have unconditional self-acceptance. Now, most troubled and troublesome kids struggle with 3 things: estrangement, not feeling connected to people around them, shame, and powerlessness. Now, shame can be the primary feeling they seek relief from by drinking, using drugs, shutting down in school, dropping out of school, or suicide. Now, shame can also cause them to keep what they think and feel and what they might struggle with a secret, and cause them to be less likely to seek or accept help that's available to them, because they believe that seeking or needing that help is one more way that they don't live up to expectations. Now, either one of these things can play out tragically, for example, with suicide. Now, so unconditional self-acceptance means encouraging them to choose to see whatever they think, feel, say, or do, have in the past or might in the future, as part of being human and understandable, given that they are a kid and what their life experience have been so far and what they have to deal with at the moment. Now, one of the ways you convince them as part of being human is to simply ask them, do you think you're the first person in human history to think, feel, say, or do that, or struggle with what you do? Do you think you'll be the last? Do you think you have a lot of company? And if you do have a lot of company, if you're not the first person, you're not the last person to think, feel, say, and do things or struggle with something, what does that suggest about what you think, feel, say, or do or struggle with? And the answer is it's part of being human. Now, it would also help if you choose to have unconditional other acceptance, which means you choose to look at what they say and do or struggle with the same way and let them know it. Now, that doesn't mean you have to like or agree with what they say or do or even tolerate it. It just helps temper your emotional response to what you don't like or don't agree with if you choose to look at things that way. Now, the most empowering thing you can do for them is to teach them to have an internal locus of control. Now, the best way to teach them to have an internal locus of control is for you to develop one and model having one for them. Okay? Because most of us grow up with an external locus of control because all the people around us have an external locus of control. They were models for us, and that's why we end up, part of the reason why we end up having an external locus of control instead of internal. Now, again, we go back to this feeling or this formula we had, event plus thoughts equals feelings, and the same things are true. What others say or do is just an event. Your thoughts cause how you feel, not what others say or do or what happens. There's always more than one way to look at anything. Some ways will make you feel better, others worse. Some will make it easier to deal with you don't like, others harder. It's always your choice how to look at things. Therefore, it's always your choice how you want to feel. Now, here's an example as a parent. If you have an external locus of control, you might be saying things like, these kids are driving me crazy. If you develop an internal locus of control, you'd be more likely to say, so I'm driving myself crazy by the way I choose to look at what those kids do. Now, teaching them to have an internal locus of control is a big part of what I call mental and emotional karate, which is teaching them to defend themselves mentally and emotionally against the verbal attacks of their fellow kids, their peers. Now, names get perceived as a threat to the symbolic self. And remember, this brain treats a threat to the symbolic self the same as one to life and limb, which is why people often make much more out of name calling than they need to. Now, when I was a kid, we were taught sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Well, that turns out to be true, because names are just an event to each one of us. Someone calls us a name, that's just an event. Now, ultimately, what I try to teach and encourage kids to practice saying to themselves so it becomes automatic is, you can think, feel, say whatever you want to about me. That's your choice. But it's my choice how I look at and feel about myself. And you don't get to make those choices for me unless I let you, and I choose not to. Now, there's a thing called rough spot training for young kids, and it was developed by my friend and mentor, Terry London, and his wife, Amor Manjas, who's a kindergarten teacher. And a rough spot is basically means when they feel bad. And they use a balloon as a visual, and they blow that balloon up and ask it, how big is this rough spot? And they say a little bit bigger, and they keep blowing the balloon up until the kid says, that's how big my rough spot is. The goal is to shrink the balloon, okay? And they teach them about hot and cool thoughts. Like, these thoughts will make you feel worse, these thoughts will make you feel better. Now, what they hopefully learn with rough spot training is there's a relationship between thoughts and feelings, and that they have a choice what they want to think, and that they have more control over how they feel than they previously thought they did. Now, you also want to teach them to differentiate between wants and needs. You can simply just ask, do you need that or just want it? For example, I have a little granddaughter, 3 years old, named Emily, who come up and say, Grandpa, I need, and then she'll tell me she needs something. And I'll say, you need it or want it? And sometimes she'll say, I need it. And I'll say, you're not going to die if you don't get that. It's okay to just want it. Okay, so that's a simple way to challenge that with a little kid. Now, the other way we challenge it, I mentioned earlier, you can ask, say things like this: you need air, water, and food. You'll die in minutes, weeks, or days or weeks without them. Do you need that, whatever you're talking about? Do you need that like you need air, water, and food? Are you going to die if you don't get that? Do you need it, or is it just nice to have? Do you need it or just want it? Now, if they make demands of themselves, you can challenge that the way we talked about earlier. Why do you have to? You have to or just want to? And hopefully they learn to realize they don't have to, they just want to. Now, and you could say that's okay. You have a right to want whatever you want. Teach that lesson, teach them that rule. But you don't have to do anything, and neither does anyone else. Now, if they say, I can't, why can't you? You can't or just don't want to. And the answer is you can, you just don't want to, and that's okay to not want to do something. You can do whatever you put your mind to. It's a good time to instill that belief in them. Now, if they make demands of others, why do they have to? Why do those other kids have to do what you want? They have to, or you just want them to, okay? And why can't they do things you don't like? They can't, or you just don't want them to. Now, let's talk about mindset for a second. Mindset is always key to dealing with kids, especially troublesome ones. Now, you have a right to want them to do whatever you want, but an authoritarian mindset is a setup to find a lot of things to upset yourself about, okay? Because if you're saying they have to do this and they have to do that, it makes them not doing it a much bigger threat than if you just simply wanted them to or didn't want them to. So you have to challenge that authoritarian mindset. And this is a problem I think we have with a lot of police in the United States. We have a lot of police overreacting to what people say and do, and many people are over 1,000 people a year get killed by police. And it's because they have this mindset that they have to do what I tell them to because I'm a police officer. Okay. Well, why do they have to? They have to, or you just want them to. You have a right to want them, but why do they have to? Okay. And the only correct answer is they don't have to. They don't have to. I just want them to. And if you say they can't, like a police officer might say, well, they can't disobey me and disobey a direct order. Well, why can't they? They can't, or you just don't want them to. And the only correct answer is they can, I just don't want them to. They can do whatever they want to. Now, it's important to remind yourself, you never control what others think, feel, say, or do. And that's even true with kids, unless you're going to manhandle them. You only control what you think, feel, say, and do. You can influence what others think, feel, say, and do. So the trick is to use what you do control to influence what kids think, feel, say, and do in a positive way. Now, you don't want everything to become about power and control or revenge, and it can. Okay. Now, if it does become about power and control, kids will sometimes get all puffed up and, I can do whatever I want to. You can't tell me what to do and all that, things like that. Well, there's a technique called taking the wind out of their sails, where instead of arguing with them saying, you're going to do what I tell you to, you instead say, you're right. You can do whatever you want to. No one can stop you if you make your mind up to do something. It's totally up to you what you want to do. That's stipulating that you don't have control over them. But then you can also respond with, but here's what I'm going to do if you do that, because I can do whatever I want to too. So it's a technique called taking the wind out of their sails. Now, you also want to challenge any awfulizing either you or they engage in. And we mentioned this earlier, how to do it. Is it awful or just unpleasant? Is it awful inconvenient or just uncomfortable? Now, when a child is awfulizing, or even if your spouse was awfulizing or a friend, there's a rule. The last thing they need is someone agreeing with them. So you don't want to agree with them. That's what kids do with each other. When one's awfulizing, the other one will, oh yeah, that really is awful. I know what you mean. And it just makes them worse. So you don't want to do that. Now, with my little granddaughter, Rosie, who's 5, A lot of times she'll get upset about something and I'll say, Rosie, big deal or little deal? And she's learning to say little deal, Grandpa. And she calms down immediately. Her field thermostat comes down a whole notch or more. Now, if they're either you or they are saying, I can't stand something, again, you can't stand it or just don't like it. And the only correct answer is I can stand it. I'm not going to die or go crazy just because of that. I just don't like it. Now, if you're labeling damning them or they're labeling damning you or someone else, why are they that just because they did that? They're that or just did a stupid or idiotic thing. They're stupid or just did something you didn't like. Now, I want to switch now to some unhealthy life habits. Alcohol, drugs, smoking, overeating, all kinds of things that people do. That's what I try to prevent as a health teacher. And the important thing to remember about those is behavior starts and continues because it serves a purpose. And what gives it purpose is people generate too much emotion. And that gives purpose to all kinds of unhealthy behavior. Now, as long as an unhealthy behavior continues to serve a purpose, it will be difficult to stop engaging in it. And it will continue to serve a purpose as long as someone generates more emotion than they know what to do with or than they want to have. Okay. Now, also with regard to unhealthy health habits, it's important to remember about ruts. This is a tool you need to employ here. Ruts come from prior practice rehearsal. They make behaviors automatic. They're easy to slip into, hard to stay out of or get out of once you're in them. And once we make ruts, we can't get rid of them. So if we've practiced smoking, drinking, or eating, overeating, whatever, we're never going to be able to get rid of those ruts. And doing those things will remain automatic for us to do. We can only make new ruts and hope they compete with our old ones, to do something different, to eat differently, to do something instead of smoking, like exercising. We do that by practicing new ways of behaving. But we can always slip into our old ruts. There's an old saying, once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. Or sometimes people will quit smoking for years and have one cigarette. Next thing you know, they're back to smoking 2 packs a day. That's because of ruts. And it's important to recognize we have these ruts and that we can always slip back into them. Now, I want to talk a little bit about boredom and whining because these are some modern day problems. Life is more convenient and comfortable than it's ever been in human history, okay? Obviously, it's not as equally comfortable and convenient for everyone, but it's more convenient and comfortable than ever in human history before. Now, people develop a tolerance for comfort and convenience just like they do for alcohol and drugs. It takes ever more comfort and convenience to give them the same satisfaction they got from less before. And what's happening is people become increasingly intolerant of discomfort and inconvenience, and they do what Albert Ellis used to call whining. And they become more demanding. They become less satisfied and more likely to find more things to upset themselves about, even though things are better than they've ever been before. Okay. So I think it's important to be aware of that. And they develop what we call low frustration tolerance, or LFT, where they're telling themselves, I can't stand doing things that are hard. It has to be easy for me to do it. It shouldn't be so hard. It should be easier than it is. Okay. Well, that just makes life more miserable by thinking that way. Now, people also develop a tolerance for stimulation and pleasure like they do for alcohol and drugs. So it takes an increasing amount of stimulation and pleasure to give them the same satisfaction a smaller amount once did. Kids are overstimulated today with all kinds of electronic stuff. Now, what happens then is you end up with boredom. Boredom is similar to depression because it's making a demand that life be different than it is. Making depression, you're basically saying this shouldn't be happening to me. I shouldn't have to deal with this. Life should be easier or better. And depression, you're basically saying life should be more exciting than it is. Now, the thing about boredom, though, like every other feeling, it doesn't come from outside us. It comes from inside us. Activities and people don't bore us. We bore ourselves by how we choose to look at things and what we choose to expect of life in the first place. Now, last thing I'm going to talk about is financial debt. A lot of people are in deep financial debt. Now, in the United States, they say the average person has something like $60,000 in debt. Now, I think a simple way to explain that is a rule that we have. Behavior intended to satisfy a perceived need will win out over behavior intended to satisfy a rational preference. Okay. No one wants to be in debt. That's a rational preference. But people start to think they need things they simply want that would be nice to have. And they go out and get those things and end up in sometimes in significant debt. Now, there's things that encourage people to think they need things they simply want. Advertising does that. That's the whole goal of advertising, is to get you to think you need something you simply might want and might be nice to have, and to go out and buy it. Okay. Seeing others have things. There's a big wealth inequity where there's people who have very little see people driving by in fancy cars with fancy clothes, living in big houses, and some people are on the streets. So that can create a perceived need. Being without things for long times, like in Ukraine. A lot of people are going to come away from that experience, if it ever does end, thinking they need things now that they haven't had for a long time, or losing things you once had. But what you want to do is challenge your perceived needs. Do you really need that, or is you just want it? And is it nice to have? And I'll finish by leaving you with two of my favorite sayings with regard to this. Time and life are our only real possessions. And the older you get, the more you start to realize that. And the other side of it is everything we own owns us. The more things I have, a house, a car, a dog, the more things I have to take care of, and the more it takes away from my freedom to do what I really might want to do with my life. So everything we own owns us. The time and life are our only real possessions. And that concludes my presentation. Let me stop sharing here if I can figure out how to get there. Trying to figure out how to stop sharing. Oh, there you go. Okay, stop. Share. Okay, window is closed. Okay, I'm all done. Thank you.
There you go, Ray. Thanks for,
Okay, sir.
yeah, hi. Good evening, everyone. Sorry I was late. Had another appointment. So looks like good stuff. I was just going through your PowerPoint, skimming through it, and got your usual 178 slides. Damn.
Yeah,
Good stuff, though.
As I go through it, no matter how many times I edit it, I go through and I found mistakes. It's like, how did I miss that? It's that redundancy of the brain.
No. When I go through mine, they get longer and longer. It
Yeah,
gets
they always
worse.
do.
So we have a lot to say and try to say it quickly, but that's tough sometimes. So appreciate you guys joining in, and hope that was helpful for you. As usual, I was making notes fast as I can and your stuff is so good. So anybody have some takeaways from this?
Looks like doctor is on a bus or a plane, or a train maybe.
Looks like he's in a disco.
Oh, I know the ceiling has a guitar and a heart on it.
Any
Yeah.
doubt
It's
or any
moving now. It
clarification?
must be a train, I think.
You can any doubt or clarification regarding the topic?
I'm
Say
sorry?
it again. I'm sorry, I didn't understand. Yeah, say it again, please. Gilby?
Yes, if anyone want to ask anything about related to the topic, they can ask it now.
Any questions or comments?
Any questions, please ask. Anybody else? Vijayaraman sir, Vijayaraman sir, I think he is gone.
Yes. I'm there here. So again, a very wonderful class. This one very big little we want to solve this. Even plus source equals to feeling. What you say is not a small thing. You supported many things to prove this. I know throughout your class, but we have to practice this. That is what I got from your class. If we practice it and succeed, then we are emotionally intelligent to the maximum limit. That is what I
Got it.
felt. Here your class, very good class, very useful class. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Excellent.
Yeah, you have to practice so that
Yeah.
those becomes automatic, just like what you previously or what you currently think, feel, say, and do. That's from years of practice, and it's automatic. So you want to get some new ways of thinking and looking at things that no, people don't make me mad. I make myself mad, and that's good news. It's not something to be afraid of because it means you can stop doing that. Whereas if you think
I
they make
start
you
doing
mad,
it now itself, and I hope I can benefit you.
yeah. So
for
you
that.
just have to practice new ways. You have to retrain your brain and create new ruts with practice and rehearsal, just like you did the original ways you thought. Now you have to look at it differently, and you have to practice looking at things in new ways. And then you'll develop ruts that'll become automatic. But even then, I still sometimes will say, God, that ticks me off, or that guy immediately makes me mad. That's my old rut. But then I'll immediately snap out of it and say, no, he doesn't make me mad. I make myself mad, and I'm fine. But it takes time to get those new ruts. And even after you create those new ruts, you will slip into the old ones, but you'll be able to get out of them quicker.
Actually, on that note, if you don't mind, I'd like to share one slide here. This is about, you're talking about making it into a habit and make it into, make your own ruts. I don't know if you guys have seen this before about the 4 steps to learning. First off, we don't know that we don't know. Second off, we find out that we don't know. Third, we then can do it different. And after a while, hopefully we can make it into a habit. So some people find this useful to be able to see that they're making some progress and that the goal is to make it into a habit, into a new unconscious default thought, unconsciously competent, we call it. So
basically you raise your level of awareness of how, in ways you're incompetent, and then you start to practice new ways of doing things that make you competent, and you practice those to the point where they become automatic. I really like that slide.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good one. I've seen that before, and I can't remember where I saw it. I haven't seen it for a long time. It's good to see it again.
all right.
Any other questions or comments?
Okay, thank you very much, dear Mathis and Matt. Both you are done very well, particularly on adult basis. It's a wonderful talk. Thank you. I think any doubts from anywhere? Okay. So I'm also in a travel, so I can't speak much. Okay. Okay, then we can see in the next week also with what is the topic in next week?
It's up to Matt.
Yep.
Okay.
We were gonna do.
Sure. Okay. Jacob sir,
middle
can you
age
speak
and then
something?
age,
Jacob sir.
elderly. I think we'll do elderly.
Old age?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
I should be able to do that one
Could
easy.
do one more. Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
We're getting old, buddy.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's
Okay.
all right.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you all, and Mr. Matt, as well as Mr. Matthias. Thank you once again. So we'll meet you in the next week. Thank you, and good night. See you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye all. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ray.
Thanks.